Welcome back to the podcast. Today I am with Sherri Crowley, and we're going to be diving into addiction. Now, those of you who are high achievers probably have something that you know you're addicted to, but in specific, we're going to be talking about alcohol and even those drugs that we gravitate towards that we don't maybe want to name, but they are what we use to cope with stress, with the overwhelm. Just relax, maybe at the end of the day. Welcome to the Balance Code Podcast, a place for high achievers to step outside the hamster wheel of day to day life and start learning tools for more balance. I'm your host, Katie Russler, and I will be guiding you on this journey of discovering your balance code. Sherri, thank you so much for being here and being willing to dive into this conversation. Will you share a little bit about yourself, what you do, and where you are in the world?
Yes, thank you so much, Katie. It's my pleasure to be here. This is super fun. So I am in Boston, in the greater Boston area, and right outside of Boston, Newton, Massachusetts, to be specific. I'm a therapist by trade. I specialize in burnout, ADHD, and alcohol and substance use amongst other things. There's a couple other things, but those are the main majority of my clients. I also have a brand new, actually, at this time, by the time the podcast is out, it'll be about 6 months in, a wellness concierge business where you can think of it like a live curated Angie's List, where I help people, particularly overwhelmed, double working parent or single parent families sort through what it is they're looking for or need in terms of therapy, pregnancy, postpartum care, or other wellness practitioners of any kind, acupuncture, chiropractic, anything, tutors for their kids, educational consultants, figure out what they're looking for, what they need, and help them get connected to those resources. Very handheld, very VIP.
What a great resource and so needed in a time where we're overwhelmed with all the information coming in and you're able to help people and support them in that way. So thank you for
Yeah.
doing that. I think that's
Yeah.
amazing. This topic around substance use, the reason that I contacted you and that like this is the topic I need from you and you were like, I got this. I can do it. Was because I'm noticing more and more people gravitate away from but struggle to stop using alcohol as a form of coping at the end of the day. And I
Yeah.
think the reason so many are starting to gravitate away from like they want to like I want to get away from it is because they're realizing how much power it has over their lives and how crappy they feel the next day at work or taking care of the kids or whatever it might be and just being a normal human being where they feel I don't want to feel this way anymore but I don't know how to break the habit. Maybe they don't want to call it an addiction, and maybe we can get into the topic about physical versus psychological addiction as well. That trend I'm noticing. I don't want to drink as much, Katie. I don't want to I don't want to depend on this. What are you noticing? Are you noticing that as well? People are becoming more aware of the alcohol use, or maybe it's smoking or whatever, and wanting to pull away, but not knowing how to break the habit?
Yeah, some of my theory is actually the way society's changed of how we connect often through like video games. Particularly, I'm talking about like teenagers and young 20s, maybe more, but that's kind of turned into its own thing. And there's whole addiction pieces around that. But I have found it interesting in terms of the substances that there is some trend of kids and teens, early 20s, young adults using alcohol and substance less. That said, there's still plenty of people using them as a coping mechanism. You mentioned kind of high achieving people, and I think that there's a real societal high achievers often there's a lot of perfectionism, obviously, a lot of societal pressures and expectations and alcohol throughout time has always been I mean, saying alcohol, but you just always include substances or whatever it is, as you said in your mind, has been used as a stress and anxiety reliever as people strive for success. And I think there's a conditioning societally where it's been perceived as a reward or a necessary tool for relaxation. You always hear, the wine o'clock thing with, moms or for instance. And I think there's a real piece of like, that's what you do. I think one of the keys is people don't even know what else would I do?
Yes,
Um,
absolutely. No, you're right. I think it's okay, I'm supposed to change this. It's not good for me. I don't feel good. What do I do then? That's exactly what my clients come with. But what do I do then? Like, this is the only way I have found that works, and it's been my friend thick and thin.
yes. Yes. There's also a huge piece of it is connection. It's interesting. I don't know how familiar your listeners are or aren't with Gabor Mate, but he has a book called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And if you don't know, he's a doctor in Canada. He's like a big speaker, etc. But the reason I'm bringing him up at the very moment, he's very loved and very hated around political issues, but I'm not talking about any of that here. I think his take on addiction, he worked for many, many years with like very hard addicted population up in Western Canada. But I think he even talks about it there's Russell Brand has a documentary, and him and Russell Brand are discussing this, that the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety as much as it is connection.
Mhm.
And that is a key point where people, in order to cope and get away from alcohol or substance use, connection is really key. Not everybody goes to 12-step programs, but that's one of the key components of 12-step programs is the fellowship and the connection that people have. Or getting connected, it doesn't have to be that way. There's not one way to cut down your drinking, but in any way you do, connection, finding other things and places where you can connect is key.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that the more we kind of reflect on our own drinking style, what we're doing at the end of the day, what is it we're searching for? When we remove that, what is it we're going to need? And yeah, some of it is like, I need to fill that space with something that brings that
Yes,
comfort. Um, let's talk about the difference between physical addiction and psychological addiction, because I think the listeners need to understand that sometimes if they think, well, is my drinking a problem? I don't know. I don't know. Is it an addiction? I don't know. There's a lot of questions around it because today's world talks a lot about the physical addiction and
100%.
not the psychological addiction. So how do you explain to people the difference between the two?
So, one way I often explain the difference is the nuance between the compulsion, which can often be physical. I mean, of course, that depends how heavy of a drinker you are over what period of time. The body does develop a tolerance, and if you're a serious heavy drinker and dependent on it physically, you can die from alcohol detox without help. Now, the majority of people haven't crossed that line
Yeah.
where they can't stop physically. But psychologically, people develop emotional and behavioral patterns around alcohol when they're using it as a coping mechanism to regulate their mood. I'll just go back for a second another physical component is, due to alcohol, we look at it as a relaxing thing because it temporarily relieves feelings of stress and anxiety by depressing the central nervous system. And it releases neurotransmitters like GABA, dopamine, and pleasure and reward neurotransmitters. However, even though it's provides that temporary relief, it ultimately is a depressant because it slows the brain function, it impairs your cognitive and motor skills, and over time, it can lead to actual changes in your brain chemistry and structure, which increases your dependence and can increase depression and anxiety. So that's all there is that. But the psychological piece is kind of where it can become an obsession, and that's all mental, this connection between needing it to cope, this connection between not knowing again, I go back to, like, what else does one do? And not everybody has that, but people who have trouble stopping often do.
So the physical addiction is I've heard it described as like that itch that there's no external reason to do it. There's an internal I need. The psychological addiction is this happened, so I need to do this to deal with it. I think that's really what you're getting at. It's like it's this is my habit. This is what I do to handle this. This is how I cope with this. Like this is part of this what I do.
Yeah, what I do and
Yeah.
sometimes who I am.
Yeah.
There's often a big identity piece around I'm the party person, I'm the relaxed person with this because when I don't have this, I'm not that person or I don't know how to talk with people or I don't know how to connect with people.
Right. And if there's a family component of like, is this how my parents were winding down at the end of the day, or this is how they celebrated, or this is how they hung up with friends and they would all, get drunk together, whatever. Then you have
Yes.
that piece of this is comfortable and normal. Even if I don't agree with it logically, there's a part of it that feels what you're supposed to do. This is what you do.
Right. What else would you do? How do you celebrate without some kind of substance?
Right, right. Like that just seems so foreign. It's living in Germany where beer is, everywhere all the time. When I say about an event, like, well, we don't really have to have alcohol, but it's like, like what? And I'm like, I'm sorry, this is a very revolutionary idea. We actually can celebrate without drinking. What?
That
But
is
I
so
get it.
interesting.
Sometimes it's so ingrained in family and culture and, whatever it might be, that the idea of something different is like me telling you the sky is actually yellow and it's always been yellow, but you were
Yes.
just taught to see it as blue. No, it is blue. But you know what I'm saying? Like, it's like, no, there's absolutely no way it could ever be yellow. You're like, well,
That's so interesting. I'm curious societally, like in Germany, or in Europe in general, where there's a different somewhat form around alcohol. And do you find as many people who struggle to stop as here or more? Or
well, what I think is it gets masked very easily. What I have noticed in the trend of just the area that I live in is one, we're seeing a trend of more alcohol-free
oh,
beers and
interesting.
drinks, and so that is regularly ordered. I'm finding that my age group, late 30s, early 40s, are ordering that much faster than a regular one. And even older generations, we're noticing that too, in our community, just in general, you'll see at a restaurant more people ordering the alcohol free. They just want the taste, right? That's that habit. Like I still do the drink, but
Yeah.
I'm removing the level of alcohol. Cause again, alcohol free doesn't really mean anyway. So like
Right.
it's not zero people.
That's so true.
Like, you got that. But I would say that those who do struggle, it's easy for family members and friends to go, "Oh, no, no, they don't have a problem. No, they're fine. No, everything's okay." Like, because 'cause they're not able to see it in that light here as much as I noticed in the United States. I think some of that trend is changing. I think more people are being aware of older family members who do have alcohol problems and going like, "Ooh, I don't wanna end up like them," so that's why they're doing the alcohol-free route, right? I'm hearing more of my friends talk about that, like, "Oh gosh, they're this years old and they're still getting drunk." Or the discussion of like, "I don't like how I feel the next day." Even my clients, that's a regular like, "I'm realizing this is not fun."
Yeah.
Like, the instant
Same.
gratification isn't worth the long-term effects, and you're like, "Yeah, absolutely." I know for
Yeah.
me, one of my rules is I do not use alcohol to cope, and I'm very careful to even use it to celebrate. So it's like, well, when do you actually need alcohol? Exactly.
Right. Right.
So it's kind of like when you go, there's a neutral feeling about this. It's not for a high, it's not for a low. It's a neutral, and I'll have it. Sure, fine, it's okay. But it isn't because of a need to celebrate or a need to cope. And I, over the last few years, have gotten very strict with myself on that because I didn't want the dependency. It's very easy, as you said, when at the end of the day, you've had a stressful day to go, this is the only way I know how to wind down. And for a while there, I knew that experience. But I thought to myself, like, this is not, this is that path that gets dangerous as a mom of the slippery slope of it's 5 o'clock somewhere or wine
Right.
o'clock. And you're like, no, I, I don't tend to love going with the trends of people. So I'm like, no, I
Likewise.
don't really want to go with that trend. So, yeah, I mean, I think culturally there's shifts happening, and I would say even people that I've met from different countries around the world, it shifts in the generation, but you're right, there's a new addiction coming, and it's the tech world.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my last question to sort of wrap us up is if somebody's like, okay, I do kind of see that this is something I want to stop. There's a problem here. What are your like first two steps recommendation of what to do next once they go like, I think I have a problem or I'm realizing I don't want to depend on this as much. What do you usually advise people to do?
I usually advise people to start by cutting back and doing so by setting clear, kind of like any other goals, right? Clear, achievable limits for themselves. I think it's really important to not set yourself up for failure by making these huge changes. And this isn't any change, making huge changes all at once. I think you start by setting clear, achievable limits. Now, some people, they can say they can just do all or nothing, but people who generally can't start by setting lower, I'm only gonna do one drink or two drinks today, or whatever your limits are. I only drink on weekends, etc. And then the other thing that is a must with concurrently with this is exploring alternative coping mechanisms for stress. It can be exercise, it can be meditation. Those are great things to replace with hobbies and support. I guess this is three things, but support from friends or family or therapists or just a support somewhere. And that means looking for supportive people. Sometimes that means for a period of time hanging out less with the people you are drinking heavily with, and that's not always forever. It's for a period of time till you feel confident and clear that you can cope. And so sometimes that is avoiding situations where your temptation is high, keeping, as you mentioned, maybe you start with non-alcoholic beverages in those situations, even though, as you said, they do have a little bit of alcohol, and really knowing the things that are going to trigger you and staying away from those things for a period of time. For the majority of people, these types of interventions will work. There are people who moderation, there are some real alcoholics, I would say. When I say real alcoholics, these are people who cannot stop. And some of these people are high functioning, high achieving people, but I'm not talking about people under a bridge only or necessarily. And there is a subset of people who moderation, cutting back does not work for, and that people know if they're that person by trying it and finding out that they cannot do it and it's not willpower. They're just incapable of doing that. And for those people, they can't do moderation or cutting back. They're going to have to, they will find out that it's like stop and get help or don't. But for the more people, starting off with clear, actionable goals and replacing with more healthy coping mechanisms is probably the two places to start.
I love that you shared that. And that first one of like start to cut back. Some of my clients, their favorite thing to do now is to make themselves a fun, non alcoholic drink while they're cooking, while they're eating dinner at the end of the night to feel special still, because there's something about the pouring and there's
Right.
something about the
There's
sipping
the
that is
routines.
right, the routine, and it's comforting to have that routine. So now they mix together some things, different juices, sparkling water, and put a lime in it, and they're like, "Ooh," it just like, in a straw, it feels special still, and
Yeah,
they have said that has been enough. Like, they realized the alcohol, yes, they needed to learn other coping skills for the stress, but it was the habit and the routine, the
love
tradition of how you end your day that they were like, "Ah, I just needed to replace it with a different activity that felt the same." So my brain was like, completion. Your day's done. You've ended it with your nice drink kind of thing. So
love that.
that's a great tip as well. And I thank you to
It
those
is.
clients that you're probably listening who have shared that with me because that's been pretty powerful to share with other people. So Sherry, thank you so much for coming in, explaining to us a little bit more about what's going on, why we might be gravitating to the bottle at the end of the day, and how to recognize if it's a problem or not, and taking those steps towards improving. If people want to connect with you after this
Yeah.
episode, where can they find you?
So they can find me on Facebook is Sherri Crowley at Instagram is at concierge connector. And then I have my two websites, www.therapynewton.com is my therapy website, and my wellness concierge website is www.wellconnectconcierge.com.
Well, I'll make sure all those links are in the show notes so people can find you and follow what you're doing. And especially if they want to work on the wellness concierge, work with you, be a part of that.
Thank
Again, thank you for your time. I know it's early in the morning for you. Thank you for coming and sharing your thoughts and really helping to educate us.
thank you, Katie. This was really fun, and I love your tips, especially that last one.
Thank you.
Will
Well, and
knock
I
it
have to
out.
give it to my clients. They're the ones. So thank you. Thank you. And dear listener, here's to finding our balance code. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Take a moment to leave a rating and a review on your favorite podcast platform. That helps other listeners just like you to find this podcast too. Want to connect and learn how we can work together? Check out the links in the show notes below. Discovering your balance code doesn't have to be a one-person journey. You can have a team, and I'd love to support you. So here's to finding our balance code.